No one would have guessed a dead battery could rearrange the future of 3 lives. The battery lay flat and useless beneath a sun that made the tar shimmer like a hot pan. Jacob's hands were black with engine oil, his shirt stained where he had been leaning over a motorcycle for so long that sweat had greased the cloth into the cracks of his skin. He wiped his palms on an old rag and looked at the little sedan beside the curb as if it owed him something. Lagos hummed around him, the horns, the hawkers, the distant shout from a bus conductor calling out a destination. This was his world: sand grit, exhaust, the small workshop tucked between a barber and a printing press, and a life that balanced on slow, stubborn honesty. Helen bounced a small plastic ball on the step of their 2-room flat, her bare feet slapping the concrete. She was 8, and already his whole argument with the world. When Jacob thought of her, the hot day cooled. Helen wore a ribbon in her hair. She would not remember the precise number of naira or the brands of cereal that passed through their kitchen, but she would remember whether her father could buy her the small things that made childhood less sharp. That was the measure Jacob kept in the back of his throat. Dignity, not comfort. Pride, even when money was thin. Mariam watched from the doorway with an expression Jacob had learned to read with more fear than love, a ledger of disappointments folded into a face. She had been a school teacher before wages shrunk and schools closed. Now she taught Helen the alphabet with the same stubborn patience she used to braid Jacob's hair after they married, before there was less hair to braid and more to worry about. Mariam kept their household from unraveling. She did not scold often, but when she did, her eyes cut clean. The look was a shield and a reprimand, a reminder that shame is quieter than hunger, but older. Jacob liked to say he lived by the code of the ragged wrench: fix what is broken, be honest about what you cannot, and do not take what you do not deserve. Sometimes that code left him eating cold yam instead of sauce. Sometimes it left him staring at the school fees envelope with a hand that trembled and a bank account that told lies. But on that morning, the code took him to the side of a car whose owner sat inside, gloved and cool, the interior smelling faintly of imported leather and Lysol. Amanda Okoro was not the sort of woman who ended up with a battery dead in front of a mechanic shack. At 65, she moved with the careful attention of someone who had been taught the value of privacy. Her skin, lined like a well-loved book, had the same stubborn dignity as Jacob's. She carried it as if it were both shield and ornament. She was standing by the wheel, a little apart from her driver, when Jacob popped the hood and saw the tangle of wires. She watched him with an interest that was not condescending.
It was gentle, curious, the look someone gives when they have the time to actually notice a person. "Can you try?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but the word carried the authority of a life that had learned how to ask what it needed and be taken seriously. Jacob had fixed batteries before. He knew the smell of a sulfated cell and the sound a dying alternator made. He worked quickly, his fingers moving with the kind of competence born from repetition. He exchanged small jokes with the driver, cracked the hood, connected jumper leads, felt the charge come and the engine cough to life. The car took a reluctant breath and then steadied. The driver thanked him in halting pidgin. They handed Jacob a note with 4 figures that would cover the week's rice and probably a textbook for Helen. It was not life-changing, but it was a kindness he did not expect. Amanda pressed a slim business card into his palm before she left. Her handwriting was neat and urgent. A name, a phone number, a guardian's offer. "If you ever need anything," she said, and then added something smaller. "Come to the house. We have work, and I like a man who keeps his hands honest." The card folded itself around his thumb like a small obligation. He walked home that night with the smell of battery acid in his hair and a card tucked into his wallet as if it were a secret. Mariam noticed the card when he dropped it on the kitchen table, and her face tightened. "You know how these people talk, Jacob," she said. She was not ungrateful for the money. She resented the sudden spaces it opened in him, nights when he came home smelling of perfume and polished leather, evenings when he sat in the doorway staring at the business card as if it were a new gospel. "But she's kind," Jacob said. "She's sick of being alone," she said. "She's a kind woman." Mariam timed the phrase on him like a stone. "Kind," she repeated. "Kind and far. I do not trust people who carry their loneliness like a new coat. They burn everyone who comes close." He had expected suspicion. He had not expected how small and foreign the workshop felt after that day, how his own neighborhood began to speak of him. The men at the next shed called him Okada Mechanic, and the barber who liked to gossip measured him with a brow and a grin. People can be generous with praise until the scent of potential change appears. then praise turns to questions. Jacob squinted at those looks and felt himself shrink. But he also felt something else. For the first time in a while, the possibility of not choosing between hunger and honesty. The possibility of paying for Helen's uniform with cash and not with promises. Amanda did not call right away. She was a woman used to being patient. When she did, it was to ask if Jacob could bring his tools to her estate later that week. She had a small problem with a garden gate that wouldn't close.
The simplicity of the work made Jacob laugh. He had pictured something aristocratic and advanced, not a lift that simply needed a hinge. When he arrived, the house smelled of jasmine and something else, a kind of silence that wealth buys. The gate's hinge was, as she had said, stubborn. Jacob worked with a steady hand. Amanda watched him as she had on the street, but here the observation became a conversation. She spoke of traveling sometimes, of the quiet that comes after great loss, of the oddity of laughter when you did not expect to be able to laugh again. Her eyes lingered on Jacob without being improper. She asked about Helen and Mariam. She listened when Jacob's voice wanted to crack, and avoided the sentences that would have offered pity like a handout. People bring their loneliness into rooms like gifts they cannot refuse. Amanda's contained money and sympathy, and an invitation to be seen without the usual glare of judgment. She sent small checks, enough to tidy up the roof, pay off a debt they had been carrying like a stone. Jacob found his pride tangled with relief. He did not want his family to need her. He did not want to feel owned by her coin. But he also did not want Helen's life to be narrower than it had to be. Mariam watched the transfers into their account. She watched the school that stopped sending polite reminders. She watched the new notebooks in Helen's sack. Every evening she made Jacob dinner, but left a space on the plate as if to reserve it for the future. That gesture stung more than any slap. It kept him awake. "You walk around with her card like a talisman," Mariam said one night. "Who says a talisman cannot be dampened with rain? Do not let her be more than she is." Jacob cradled his tea and remembered the look Amanda had given him when she spoke about being alone. There was something in Amanda that was not wealth and not status. It was the rawness of someone who suddenly feared she had run out of chances. Jacob saw in her a reflection of his own edges, someone who had things, but feared they would not be enough. The workshop days rolled into weeks. Amanda called sometimes, not to hire him, but to speak. She had a voice that listened the way certain people collect stamps, methodically, with patience. She wanted to hear about Helen's first school play, about the time Jacob's uncle had taught him to solder without a mask, about the small tools that were his treasures. When a week passed and rent was due, a simple transfer arrived. When Helen needed a new workbook, it was there. Jacob's pockets felt fuller, but his heart felt skinnier for being shared. "Keep your head," Mariam said once, fingers tracing the edge of a plate as if outlining danger. "You do not owe her your life." "Nor she mine," Jacob wanted to say, but the words got tangled in the hesitation between wanting to be proud and desperate enough to swallow whatever came. In the neighborhood, talk shifted into whispers. For many, Jacob's rise was admirable. For others, it was a curiosity to sharpen into gossip. Men who had once been his friends waved from a distance. A woman at the market stopped and offered a faint smile that was not quite warm. Jacob felt the world measure him with the scales of propriety, and found the weight unfair. When the news arrived, it did not come like a bomb. Amanda's voice over the phone held something like wonder and a touch of fear. "I went for a check," she told him. "The nurse spoke of a heartbeat." Jacob's first thought was of the miracle of a body making life where it was not expected. His second thought was sudden and cold. What did this mean for those who depended on her? In the quiet that followed the call, the workshop sounded larger, emptier. He imagined Helen's smile, Helen's future, and then imagined the number of naira that could ease all the tight lines in their life. The thought was not clean. He did not tell Mariam at first. He sat on the bench, the card from Amanda folded in his palm as if it were a small flapping bird. Amanda told him she was nervous about telling people. She was used to being the older woman, wise and in control. The tiny new heartbeat under her ribs was a secret reversal of the script, the giver suddenly in need of something else: protection, privacy, maybe affection. "But you will tell her?" she asked gently. Jacob almost lied, almost kept it like a coin in his pocket. But instead he told Mariam that night at the kitchen table, and the way she listened was a small island of storm. She did not gasp, she did not throw the water glass. She set down her spoon and said loudly enough that Helen, who was coloring at the edge of the table, stopped to listen.
Amanda had been the anchor, but a new child would reorient who inherited what and who mattered. Amaka feared an unpredictable child could break whatever quiet bargain she had relied upon. She looked at Amanda's joy as a threat to the stability of the known world. Their conversations were not always loud, but they were precise. Amaka asked questions that got at the practicalities. Who would care for the child? What legal arrangements were there? How did pregnancy at 65 change a woman's standing? When Amanda's laugh came, it was smaller, fragile. She did not care for calculations the way Amaka did. She wanted to feel the rhythm of a small foot in a house that had grown still with absence. Jacob saw Amaka only once early on, at the gate where she arrived flanked by a small, purposeful silence. She was less polished than Amanda, more raw-edged, with an air of someone who had learned to sharpen her features to get what she needed. When Amaka spoke to Jacob, she measured him like a man who could be persuaded. "You know your duty to family," she said, voice low and soft as if they shared a secret that could ruin people. "We all must protect what matters. If things change, if Miss Amanda's choices make trouble for the rest of us, people have to think ahead." Jacob nodded as if he understood the request and felt the words ricochet off something fragile in his chest. He had not signed up for this kind of responsibility. He had only been a man who fixed things. Now being needed meant different things were expected. Protection, it seemed, sometimes tasted like a threat. The first time Jacob saw the ultrasound picture, he stood outside the clinic for a long while, hands in pockets as if they were too small for the world. Amanda had given him a copy, a little sheet with a gray smear and a dot that must have been the beginning. She held it with the reverence of someone who had been handed a relic. Her eyes were wet and bright. Jacob felt the world narrow to the size of that gray smudge. "Can you believe it?" she whispered. "At my age? I never thought." The possibility of a child changed angles. For Amanda, there was the scandal and the miracle tangled together. For Amaka, there was a ledger to balance, inheritance, care, the possibility of being pushed aside. For Jacob, a heartbeat pressed like a new coin against a palm already cluttered with debts. Word travels fast in Lagos, sometimes carried by gossip, sometimes by the slow churn of necessity. Soon neighbors discussed the impossibility of a woman bearing a child at her age, the medical wonder of it, the social consequences. Men who had once sought Amanda's attention with polite bows began to refresh their names in her guest book. A baby becomes more than a baby in circles where lineage translates into security. People started to speak of legacy. Miriam heard the talk and could not swallow her discontent.
The day she slapped Jacob was not the day the ultrasound arrived. It was later, after murmurs had become eyes at the market, after a neighbor had muttered something cruel and then told everyone it was a joke. She took his face between her palms, not to smooth it, but to make him look, and she said words that were expected and sharpened. "You have to guard our name," she said. "You've let other men's money sit in your pocket, and now you are turning blind. Who will say our daughter had a father who stood firm? You must be careful." Her hand did not hurt like a blow, but it landed like a verdict. Jacob's shame was not about the slap, but about how small he felt in the face of the map of possibilities. He loved Miriam. He loved Helen with a fierceness that made him cruel to himself. The thought that he could be the kind of man who would let their dignity be auctioned off without knowing the terms was a blade. For her own part, Amanda did not want scandal. She had grown up with the knowledge that public life can be unforgiving to those who seek private joy. She hired staff with care, kept to rooms where the morning sun came in thin and clean, and made lists of the friends she trusted. But loneliness punctures even careful walls. In the long nights after long days, she called Jacob and asked about Helen's laugh and whether the neighborhood boys still played marbles. He told her things he had not meant to tell anyone, about his father who had taught him to take a car apart and fit it together with better hands, about the time he had stayed up all night to finish a job and watched the city change color as dawn moved in. Her responses were sometimes small gifts, a bag of rice, a check to catch up on a bill, a book for Helen. These gestures felt like oxygen. Then one afternoon, Jacob received a visit that shifted his sleep forever. Amaka came alone to the workshop without fanfare. There was a fold of severity in her posture, and in her eyes something like a plan. She watched him bend over a carburetor with the kind of attention reserved for things one intends to change. The children who clustered at the gate fell silent, as if they were watching a ceremony. "You are clever," she said when he straightened, the words offered like a test. He blinked. "I try to be." She smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. "You know how the world turns, Jacob. There are ways to make sure you and yours sleep better. Miss Amanda has been generous, yes, but times change. People change with money. You do not want to wake one morning to find you and your family counted out. Jacob felt the air go thin. There was a careful tone to her voice that told him she had practiced this conversation. It was impossible to be both insulted and curious. His hands, which had so often told the truth before the rest of him, found their way to a rag and wiped them with a movement that was both habit and a prayer. "What are you saying, Jacob?"
Amaka took from her bag a small envelope. She did not hand it to him yet. The envelope was heavier than the paper suggested. Perhaps it contained notes. Money is a prop that can hum as persuasion. It is not only the sum that stuns, it is the suggestion that what you have been lacking can be replaced with ease. Amaka's presence there, the occult coolness of her smile, put every lesson Jacob had learned in a new balance. "Think," she said, 20 million. For someone like you, that is a future. You can move. You can give Helen anything you want. No more asking the neighbor for rice. No more shame. All of this for a small thing." She looked at him as if the deed she proposed were as small as closing a gate. The envelope lay on his workbench like a promise and a curse. Jacob's heart beat in his ears. He imagined the numbers in his head adding up to a life with no late fees, no arrears, no sudden trips to a lender who expected more than money in return. He saw Helen's hair in the morning, smooth and content. He saw Mariam relaxed. He felt the slow, intoxicating warmth of relief. But even as he thought of what the money could do, he felt stung by the grotesque bargain implicit in Amaka's words. A small thing, a life. The air smelled now not of petrol but of iron and the sour tang of a decision that might make someone else's life end. His hands dropped to his sides. He heard his father's voice in a memory. "Do what your hands can hold without shame." He heard Mariam's voice. "You are our rock." Amaka did not explain. She simply set the envelope gently face down, like a coin on a scale, and let the silence do the rest. Jacob did not take it. He did not push it away either. He turned the thing in his hands as if feeling the weight of two futures at once. Outside, Helen's laughter cut across the alley, a small bell of normality. Inside, the workshop felt suddenly too narrow for the size of the choice put before him. He had fixed brakes and fuses, but he had never fixed fate. A breeze nudged the tarpaulin overhead. The hum of Lagos seeped through the cracks. Amaka's face held the patience of someone who was used to persuading by slow pressure. "Think of your family," she said. "Think of what you could do." Jacob stood very still. He thought of the times he had lied awake with worry for Helen. He thought of Mariam's hands folded in the evening, of her muted anger. He thought of how luck sometimes wore the face of a stranger. He looked at the envelope and then at Amaka, and then he closed his eyes. When he opened them, his hands were on the bench and the envelope lay untouched. The workshop felt suddenly too narrow for the size of the choice put before him. He had fixed brakes and fuses, but he had never fixed fate. A breeze nudged the tarpaulin overhead. The hum of Lagos seeped through the cracks. Amaka's face held the patience of someone who was used to persuading by slow pressure. "Think of your family," she said. "Think of what you could do." Jacob stood very still. He thought of the times he had lied awake with worry for Helen. He thought of Mariam's hands folded in the evening, of her muted anger. He thought of how luck sometimes wore the face of a stranger. He looked at the envelope and then at Amaka, and then he closed his eyes. When he opened them, his hands were on the bench and the envelope lay untouched. The workshop felt suddenly too narrow for the size of the choice put before him. If you're drawn into Jacob's choice, hit like and stay with the story. He sent the envelope away in the most honest way he could think of, folded the money into his own pocket later when Amaka had left, and buried the number in the noise of work.
Jacob looked at the small photograph, the little swing with the childish paint, and at the woman who had been both patron and friend. He could feel the world rearranging itself into an impossible geometry of debts that were not always monetary. He left her house with fewer answers and more resolve. That night, he sat on the stoop and watched Helen sleep through the thin curtain. The envelope in his trouser pocket burned like a secret and weighed like a future. He thought briefly, with a foul clarity, of what would happen if he took Amaka's offer and bought freedom. He thought of the price of that freedom. He thought of the heartbeat that had no voice. He thought of Mariam's hand and the way it had pushed him away that one night when she had been afraid. The moral landscape of his choices looked like jagged rock. There was no single path over it, only hard stepping. Then, just as he began to believe in the small, soothing acts that kept them alive, a new rumor slipped into the neighborhood halls and into Jacob's ears like rain in an open roof, that a plan had been spoken of late in the estate, a plan driven by fear and the kind of greed that disguises itself as pragmatism. It came to him in whispers, that Amaka had been seen in the market buying things she had not been known to purchase, making arrangements with people who spoke in ellipses and closed doors. Jacob's stomach rolled. He wanted to confront Amaka, to demand the truth, but confronting a woman whose hands were used to making deals meant risking a reprisal that could be ugly in ways he did not yet understand. He had fixed many cars, but he had never repaired the shape of a betraying heart. The envelope in his trousers seemed to pulse like a second heartbeat. One evening, as dusk laid a cool hand over the city, Jacob paced his small room and picked up one of Helen's drawings. She had drawn a house with a bright red roof, and inside the house she had drawn a family that looked little more than stick figures. In bold letters across the top she had written, "Home." Jacob pressed his forehead to the paper, feeling the faint impression of her pencil through the page. This was what he lived for, the small certainties a child has about love. He told himself he would do right by that drawing. He meant it. But intention is a precarious companion when other hands place a coin on the table and call it mercy. 2 nights later, Amaka's son, Chisholm, came by the workshop and loitered awkwardly, offering a shy grin that made Jacob uneasy. The boy's school uniform was new, crisp, clearly bought recently. Jacob studied the boy as he cleaned a spark plug, looking for the point where a mother's decision rippled into her children's lives. "You look tired, mister," Chisholm said, and then, in a moment of disarming childlike frankness, he added, "Mama says things must be safe, that's all." Jacob did not know what safe meant in the context of that family.
He only knew the sharp throb in his temples that would not be eased by the feel of money in his hand or the thought of his daughter's shoes. The day before the evening the restaurant would be booked and the letter that would determine the direction of everything drafted but unsigned, Jacob had a dream. He was at the edge of a long field, and a small child, small because it was Helen, called out to him from the other side. The ground between them was water and oil and change. Jacob could see a hand reaching out, but he could not reach without crossing an expanse that threatened to drown him. He woke with his pillow wet and the taste of iron in his mouth. The world had placed him at a crossroads with little ceremony. He had not been given the choice to prepare. Choice was thrust upon him like a sudden summons. Somewhere in the estate, under chandeliers perhaps, people were planning while others were counting. For Jacob, it all collapsed into decisions that would hurt someone somewhere. He did not yet know how his refusal or acceptance would reshape their lives. He only knew that a bottle in a handbag, an envelope on a bench, a small hush behind closed doors, could make of him a man who either protected a new heartbeat or took the easy route to shelter his own. He did not know if his hands, which could fix springs and brakes, could fix the moral fracture introduced into his life. Outside, Lagos did not stop. Vendors called their wares, and a bus screeched past, hissing like a warning. The city had a way of making monumental choices feel ordinary. People fell into the rhythm and learned to live with choices they would not have expected to make. Inside his chest, a different rhythm beat, the one that kept him awake at night, counting possibilities like beads. He turned the envelope over under his palm in the dark and slipped it under a loose board in the workbench, where coins and lost tools collected their own small lives. The envelope's presence there was proof that the world had offered him a ledger to sign. He went to sleep holding the line that he had always kept, "Do not do to others what you would not wish done to you." But by morning, that line felt less like a shield and more like a thin, fragile bridge over a wide, uncertain river. He had to choose whether to step onto it or let it go, and watch the waters claim what lay beneath. The choices did not make themselves. The city waited, patient and indifferent. Amaka's voice had been patient too. She had left the envelope on his bench and a small, quiet line in the air that would not be erased. Jacob's hands traced the old scratches on the workbench as if they could read a future in the gouges. He thought of Helen's drawing, of Amanda's laugh, of Miriam's steady anger. He thought about what dignity meant when someone offered you all the things that had been missing. He could not yet imagine how this would all end. He only knew that the crossroads had arrived, and that the poor mechanic who had always believed his hands told the truth would have to make a decision that would hold consequences for more than his own family. He did not sleep much the night before the dinner. The city shifted around him in low, familiar pulses, a distant generator coughing on, a radio playing praise in a call and response, a group of late workers laughing under a sodium lamp. Jacob lay on his back and watched the ceiling until the dark stopped being a backdrop and became a pressure. Helen's small breathing came from the next room like a metronome he could not stop. He rose before dawn and went to the workbench, not because he had a job, but because habit steadied him.
He ran a rag over a wrench until the metal shone as if new. The act of cleaning something until it obeyed him made the decision feel less like faith and more like work, something with parts he could put in order. The envelope he had shoved beneath the loose board had been taken out twice without his permission. Once he had folded it in his hand in the market and thought of shoes for Helen. Another time he had imagined the number in the envelope being enough to move them away from the constant worry about electricity bills and rent. Each time, the fantasy retreated like a tide. He never reached for the money. The touch was always a reminder that relief bought in the shade of another's harm would be a comfort with a stain. The invitation to the restaurant had come in the small card, not the sort Amanda used for her formal affairs, but a simpler thing, the sort handed by a woman who wanted a private conversation. The place was a modest, upmarket restaurant in Ikoyi, where the lighting meant strangers could be judged without the world seeing it. Amaka preferred places where consequences felt remote, where new plans could be spun into polite conversation and folded into leather bags. Jacob walked there with his best shirt, the one that had been pressed for Mariam's cousin's wedding last year. He felt absurd in it, like a man wearing someone else's life. He practiced putting his face on, calm, deferential, a man who knew his place and would not be tempted beyond reason. Under his shirt, his hands trembled as if he could feel the future in his fingertips. When he pushed through the restaurant door, the place smelled of citrus and boiled rice, of carefully planned hospitality. Amanda sat at a table near a wide window that opened onto the street, the glass catching late light like something that had survived a lot and continued to shine. She wore a scarf the color of soft smoke and held a menu she never read. At her side, polite and contained, sat Amaka, less refined, with the taut energy of someone who had always had to take. There were other figures at the table, a man in a suit who was likely Amaka's lawyer or a family manager, a server who moved like someone who had lied to carry delicate things.
Jacob's legs felt uneven as he approached. The air seemed to thicken with new rules. Amaka stood as he came in and gave him a small, strategic smile. "You came," she said. Her voice was a blade that looked like silk. Jacob kept his head low. Amanda rose and reached out a hand. There was a hesitation in her touch, a question in the way the fingers met his. It was warmer than he expected. For a moment he forgot the envelope under his workbench and the small power it suggested. They sat. Plates were placed before them, and food that had been chosen to be unobtrusive came steaming. For a while they talked of many things without stopping at the words that mattered. Jacob spoke of a stubborn carburetor that had finally given up, and the sound of rain on a tin roof. Amanda told a story about a trip she had once taken to the coast and the fish roast they had there. Her laugh was small and true, a sound that wanted to live in ordinary spaces. Amaka contributed with exact questions and gentle asides, as if she were engraving a script. Then, inevitably, the conversation narrowed. "I called you here for help, Jacob," Amaka said, and that help carried a softness like a promise. She folded her hands and looked at him as one looks at an instrument one intends to use. Jacob felt his palms go damp. The envelope in the bench felt like a memory he had not yet confessed to. "Anything for Miss Amanda," he said. "Anything." Amaka smiled in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. From her bag she produced, with a show that betrayed a plan, a small, unremarkable bottle. It was no bigger than a child's juice container, clear glass, the cap tightly screwed. It sat on the table like a pebble dropped in calm water, making a ring of anxiety spread outward. The server walked by, and in a curtained motion put another glass beside Amanda's plate, as if this were merely a part of the evening. Jacob's throat dried. He knew enough of human deals to read that a bottle on a table was a symbol more dangerous than any currency. It suggested a single possibility that made every respectable thing in the room tilt. Amaka did not speak of it in the blunt terms of a villain. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed a conversation with a mirror. "It's simple," she said. Her eyes did not leave Jacob's. "We will make sure the problem disappears quietly. A little trouble and a little distance. No fuss. 20 million naira. Enough to secure your family for years. Consider it gratitude. Consider it security. Consider it a favor." Her hands were still. The light feathered on the bottle and made it seem obscene, like a piece of something too personal brought into public air. I imagined the envelope in my pocket, the small virtuous things it could buy. I imagined Helen's uniform and Mariam's quiet face unlined I worry. A life without the constant clawing need. All of them lay in front of him like a shop window to be peered into from the wrong side.
Amaka's expression had changed. She looked like someone listening to a distant conversation that did not belong to her. "Amaka," she said, low and controlled, "we are not in need of violence for arrangement. You and I have always found other ways." Amaka's jaw tightened. "Other ways," she repeated. "And what if other ways are slow? I have mouths to feed. I have debts.
A child will change everything. If things change, nothing will be the same. Jacob felt the room shrink until he could count its breaths. He imagined an infant he had seen in the ultrasound, the grainy certainty like an anchor thrown into murky water. He pictured Amaka gently touching her belly, the way someone might touch a secret to make sure it remained real. He thought of the years of care Amaka had poured into people like his own, how generosity had sometimes been the only thing that kept their small household from breaking. His fingers clenched around the napkin until the paper creased. He thought of Mariam's hand on his jaw the night she had slapped him, not that she wished him harm, but that she wanted him to remember the shape of their vows. He thought of his father's words, "Do what your hands can hold without shame." How did a man measure shame when the ledger included a child with no voice? Silence sat heavy between the plates. Jacob felt, more than heard, a pressure to choose. He could take the envelope he had not wanted and put it into a life that might rise from the dust. He could let Amaka's plan proceed and sleep with money under his pillow while someone else's heartbeat went quiet. Or he could stand and refuse and unlock a chain of consequences that might break everything he had. He thought of the worst kind of pride, the kind that keeps a man from asking for help until he has no dignity left to give. The 20 million was not only about comfort, it was about the possibility of never needing favors again. For a man who had known the small humiliations of watching neighbors whisper, it whispered of unembarrassed living. "Think of your daughter," Amaka murmured, like temptation disguised as counsel. "Can you say you would not give her a better life?" The question was a spear and a hand. Jacob felt the music of a hypothetical future. Helen in a new school uniform, her hair brushed neatly, the constant scrawl of worry replaced by the slow hum of certainty. His mouth wanted to form the shape of an answer that would please both halves of him. Take what you need and still be a good man. He looked at Amaka. Her face had folded into the quiet of someone who had been living in this negotiation as long as she had. Her hands rested on the table, small and patient. Her eyes, when they met his, were not shocked. They were searching. "Jacob," she said slowly, the word falling like a small bell. "What will you do?" Jacob's thoughts broke into shards then, and in each shard a memory reflected.
His father's laugh in a workshop where a young hand was learning to solder. Helen's drawing of a house with a red roof. Mariam braiding hair and humming a hymn she had known as a girl. Amanda's laugh at the coast, and the way she had asked him for nothing but to be present. Amaka's voice in the market, and the new shoes on Chisholm. Never been only that. To allow the bottle to do its work would be to make an act that could not be undone, to take a heartbeat someone would never feel. The idea of accepting such a bargain, even for the future of his child, felt like a theft of a life he had no right to claim. For a brief moment, fear rose like a tide. What if Amaka's people were not amateurs? What if she had others who would not hesitate? What if his refusal brought ruin upon them anyway? The world he wanted to protect could be burned by the very choice he made to save it. He thought of how the people he loved could suffer not because he erred, but because someone else refused to be merciful. Jacob swallowed. His voice came out thin, then steadied. "I cannot," he said. The words felt inadequate. I could feel every eye at the table tighten, the plates and silverware listening like a jury. "I can't take someone else's life, no matter what you promise." Amaka's expression hardened into something like disbelief. She leaned forward, lowering her voice into a vein of reasoning that spoke of consequences like rewards. "You can help your family," she said. "You can start an entirely new life. Why be the one who ruins them by refusing?" "Because I would have ruined myself first," Jacob answered. He could feel the heat of wanting to explain, to justify, but there was a steadiness in his chest now that did not come from the thought of money. It came from the image of Helen asleep and the moral line his father had taught him. "I won't be rich if I have to wash my hands in someone else's blood." For a second the room held its breath. Amaka's fingers tightened around the bottle. Her nails were pale triangles against the glass. "If you refuse," she said coldly, "there are other people who can be hired." Jacob understood instantly what she meant. She had the network. She had resources. The implication was not empty bluster. She had lived by the currency of influence and knew its dark edges.
But the idea that someone else would do what he refused made the choice feel heavier. It married his personal morality to the consequences beyond his control. He was deciding not only whether he would be compromised, but whether he would become complicit in the harm of others. He thought of how little ownership he had over the world that would follow his act, and how, nevertheless, his refusal might at least deny immediate complicity. Amanda watched them, and then her face shifted in a new direction.
She reached for the bottle before anyone moved. Her fingers closed not so much to grip it, but to lift it into the light. For a moment, she looked like a woman holding an ugly animal and weighing what to do with it. "I want the truth," Amanda said. Her voice was small but firm. "Jacob, tell my sister that you refused. Tell her why. Tell her who you are." Jacob felt a strange relief. To say no aloud in front of witnesses was less like a confession and more like a prayer. He told the truth. Not an argument, but a statement. "I have a daughter," he said. "I have a wife. I will not let my hands be the instrument that takes away what cannot be given back." A ripple threaded through the table. The man in the suit looked uncomfortable. A server pretended not to listen. Amaka's mouth tightened. For a brief second, she was a woman in private, stripped of the scaffolding she used to build a public life. "You are making a mistake," Amaka hissed. "You will regret this." Jacob felt rage flicker. Not for Amaka alone, but for the world that would give men like her leverage over others' choices. "I'll take my chances," he said. And then the thing he had been trying to avoid, the practical unraveling, began. Amaka slid a slender hand under the table and signaled. Her lawyer stood up with the quiet authority of a man who presumes legality will buy time. There was movement, a discreet phone call placed, a polite cough. Jacob felt like a child whose misdeed had been discovered, though he had broken no law. The restaurant's manager shuffled over and suggested they take their discussion elsewhere to avoid scandal. The air smelled now like lemon and tension. Before the manager could lead them from the table, Amanda did something Jacob would later remember with a tremor. She stood up, placed the bottle on the table with deliberate calm, and looked at the people around her. "I will not be spoken of as a problem tonight," she said, and her voice had a steadiness that did not match the smallness in her chest. "If my sister wishes to make arrangements, she will do it without endangering me." Amaka's lips parted as if to speak, but Amanda continued. "Jacob has refused. That is the truth. If you have other offers of help, bring them in a way that does not risk a human life." Her eyes landed on Amaka and then on the man who had not yet spoken. "This table will not be where we barter for blood." For a heartbeat, Amaka's face registered not just anger, but fear. She had been prepared to bargain. She had not imagined that Amanda would be the one to set the boundary. Amaka's hand went involuntarily to the bottle, and in a swift movement that was half defiance, half concession, she swept it into her back. It looked like a woman picking up her grief and carrying it away so no one else had to see. They moved from the table with the awkwardness of people who had almost stepped over a line and then decided to pretend it had not been there.
Jacob felt the eyes of other diners follow them like a net. As he walked out into the cool air, he realized his heart had been pounding, not from fear of being found wanting, but from the sense that he had stood for something that might, in the long run, be more expensive than money. After the restaurant, events congealed quickly. Amanda called a lawyer and a security person she trusted. She asked Jacob to meet her at the estate the following morning. Amaka, who had left with a tight face, did not return home that night. Rumors began their inevitable work. Jacob went home and told Miriam everything. He expected her to be furious. He expected another slap to land like an indictment. Instead, Miriam listened. She folded a towel with hands that trembled slightly, not with anger now, but with the sharpness of someone who had been waiting for him to prove what kind of man he was. "You did right," she said finally, and the sentence was a small tide. Her eyes were wet, not with forgiveness exactly, but with recognition. "You are a fool, and you are my husband. You could have taken that money and nothing would have been said to you again. You could have refused and we would have been poor. You chose to be honest. That is all I need to know." Jacob felt something like a door open and close in him. It was not the end of everything. Repercussions would come, but the relief wrenched out of him like a breath he had been holding for too long. The next morning, Amanda arranged a meeting that was both practical and intimate. She paid visits to people who mattered, a lawyer who confirmed that she could make certain legal changes to protect her assets and the interests of the child, and a social worker who could ensure maternity care.
She put in place more security for her home. Then, in a decision that surprised both Jacob and himself, Amanda asked him to go with her to the estate's small sitting room, where she spoke plainly. "You refused," she said. "You did not take anything. I saw that. I know that sometimes the poor are expected to sell their souls for the comfort of their children. I will not let you do that." Jacob's chest tightened. "You don't have to." "You have done work for me honestly," Amanda interrupted. "That is payment enough, sometimes. But I want to be clear. I do not believe in charity that shames the giver or the receiver. I will give you something for your family, without strings." She handed him a check and then unfolded a plan. She would provide a small grant, not 20 million, that would allow Jacob to lease a better workshop in a safer area, buy one new tool that could change the kind of work he took on, and put aside enough for Helen's school fees for a while. It was not a gift from the tub of an indulgent benefactor, but an arrangement. She would pay him for regular maintenance work at the estate when he wanted to take it, and she would put in place a small trust for Helen that required his signatures and Miriam's.
Jacob knew the offer could be seen as charity. He also knew the difference between being paid for honest labor and being bought for silence. Amanda's arrangements were clear: work for work, payment for performance, a trust that required transparency. He accepted, hands trembling, because the alternative had been the second kind of bargain he had just refused. Miriam, at first, had been wary. She accepted the paperwork with the caution of someone who has seen 100 hands reach to give and then take in the dark. But she saw how Amanda looked at Jacob, with something other than pity. It was recognition. "If she pays you for work," Miriam said slowly, "then you will not owe her anything your hands cannot repay." They arranged to leave the neighborhood. Not fleeing, that was not necessary, but starting again in a place where the whispers would be less poisonous. The small grant would cover a deposit on a workshop and the cost to register a modest business name. Jacob rented a place closer to a bus route, where customers were more dependable and the rent did not hang over their nights. As for Amaka, the fallout was immediate and sharp. Her children, Emma and Chisholm, were unsettled. Without the tacit security of Amanda's unexamined largesse, their world quaked. Amaka's neighbors, who had once tolerated her dependency, began to consider the possibilities of legal consequences. The man in the suit whispered that certain threats had been made explicit, and Amanda did not choose to be silent. She pressed charges, not with the desire for punishment, so much as with the need to set a boundary. Amaka found herself called to account. She pleaded, argued, and in the end faced social exile that the estate could not ignore. Her children confronted her with the calculus of survival and betrayal. The community, which had tolerated small cruelties for the appearance of peace, began to fracture. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes in Jacob's life. Justice in Lagos was a slow machine, but there were consequences that did not rely on the law alone. Amaka's friends moved away from her. Her market stall found fewer customers. The people she had relied upon in quiet deals began to close their doors. Her family no longer saw the arrangements they had taken for granted. There was, in its own quiet way, a price for what she had almost done. Amanda, for her part, faced a different solitude. The rupture with her sister was sharp and irrevocable. She had always loved Amaka in a complicated way, a combination of obligation and tenderness. But seeing the lengths to which her sister would go forced her to reshape what family meant. For Amanda, the pregnancy remained a miracle. It was now also an urgent test of what kind of world she could create for this child. She chose, with a new tenacity, to make that world as safe as possible. She tightened security, she made careful wills, and she turned more energy to the idea of community rather than private dependence.
In the weeks that followed, Jacob found that refusing Amaka's offer did not end the pressures he faced. People still watched him, whispers still followed. There were late nights when money was thin and his stomach ached with a hunger that would not be dignified by a check. But the pressure had become honest pressure, work that would pay, bills that would be met without asking others to risk lives. He learned to say no to offers that smelled too sweet. He built a roster of work for small estates and for drivers and for market traders. He bought one new tool and fixed a van that had been leaking oil for months. He tightened his accounts. Miriam, for her part, took up a small tutoring job and began to teach a class of children Wednesday evenings. The extra money helped, but even more than that, it gave her a pace and a purpose that was not defined by waiting for others to give. They moved into the new workshop on a bright Tuesday. The place was modest, a single room with a roll-up door and a corrugated roof that did not leak as much as the previous one. Helen measured every corner and declared it good.
She found a place to hang her drawing of a house and colored it in with more vigor than before. Jacob felt the weight of small things like paying a deposit and putting a proper lock on the door. It was not 20 million naira, but it was honest, and that honesty began to taste like enough. Amanda delivered the additional funds for the trust and signed the papers that set up the arrangement for Helen. She did not come often to the workshop. She did not need to. The relationship that had existed between Jacob and her was not a romantic thing. It had been a human thread that had tied their stories to one another for a moment. After the restaurant, they spoke with a respectful distance. There were messages and visits that remained formal. Once, Amanda came by to see the place and to watch Helen try on a new school uniform paid for by the trust. She held the child in a way that suggested both gratitude and a reserve that had always belonged to her dignity. Miriam watched the exchange from the doorway, and in private, she and Jacob spoke in a different tone. "You did right," she said again, and this time her voice contained a weariness stitched with pride. "But do not think you are unhurt. We will move forward and we will watch each other. I will not be ashamed to take what we can make with honest hands." They rebuilt in the small ways people always do. A new pot bought, a stubborn leak fixed, a neighbor invited over for dinner. Some mornings Jacob still woke with the taste of iron in his mouth, reminders of choices and near misses. He kept, tucked in his wallet, the small business card Amanda had given him, not as an idol, but as a record of a time when a life intersected his in a way that demanded integrity. Time has a way of smoothing the raw edges of crisis. Weeks became months.
The child inside Amanda grew and became a story the neighborhood told more gently. People who had been quick to gossip had the short-term memory of those who survive on the news of others' lives. Amaka found that forgiveness from some people was not automatic. Her children, especially Chisholm, found it hard to reconcile the mother who had tried to bend moral rules for convenience with the one who remained their mother. They spoke openly, a small, painful therapy that no amount of furniture could buy. The family had to reconstruct itself without the steadying weight of entitlement. Amanda's child was born on a humid morning. The neighborhood heard it as a small miracle and then a normal event. The child had no title in the town, no certainties beyond the life of a woman who had chosen to protect it at considerable cost. Amanda named the baby something meaningful, a name that meant hope in the family tongue, and later, when the immediate danger had passed, she invited Jacob and his family to a quiet tea in the garden. There was no fanfare, only the soft bustle of a life that refused to be dictated by fear. When Jacob held the child for the first time, only for a minute as a neighbor might hold a child at a blessing, he felt the weight of what he had chosen. There was a heartbeat under that weight, the same heartbeat that had once been a point on an ultrasound. He thought of how near the world had been to a different kind of ending, and felt in equal measures sorrow and gratitude. They lived with the consequences of decisions. Amaka did not find easy redemption. She lost her place in a circle that had sustained her and had to build a life on different terms. Some days she ate with her children while the echo of what she had almost done muted dinner conversation. Other times she stood in the market and watched people trade without her. She learned humility that was not an ornament but a daily work. In the end, the cost she paid was social and personal. No one celebrated her as a martyr. She became a quieter person, a woman whose choices were visible and therefore no longer easily excused. Jacob's life, too, was reshaped. He became more careful with the ways choices were presented to him. The envelope under his bench became not a temptation but a lesson. Some decisions cannot be monetized without losing more than currency. He set up a small savings account for emergencies and taught Helen the small, practical skills that made a future sturdier. She learned to make a list and to stick to it. She learned, in the way children learn best, that decisions have consequences that ripple. Amanda eventually moved to a different house, closer to a quieter part of town, but she maintained the trust and continued, in her particular way, to be a presence for those she had engaged with honestly.
She wrote letters sometimes to Jacob, not as a lover, but as a person who had been given something she had no right to take back, a moral companion in a moment of crisis. Years later, Jacob would stand at the doorway of his modest workshop and watch Helen sweep the floor, humming a tune she had learned at school. Maria would be at the table marking her students' exercises. The life they had built was never without worry. There were bills and days when work was thin. There were mornings when Jacob left with grease under his fingernails and a prayer on his lips. But there was something that had been restored. The sense that when a man chose between ease bought with another's blood and an honest poverty, he had chosen to keep his hands clean. The city continued to hum around them, indifferent and magnificent, making opportunities and disasters with equal indifference. Jacob sometimes thought of the way the bottle had gleamed on the restaurant table, a small, obscene thing that had looked for a moment like the pivot of his life. He thought of Amaka's offer and of all the ways people tried to make choices easier by passing costs on to others. He thought of Amanda's child, whose life had been spared not by neutrality, but by a moral refusal. In the end, the most important change was small and domestic. Helen drew another house, and this time, when Jacob folded it and placed it in a cupboard, he smiled without regret. The roof she colored red had a tiny window with a child's face peering out. Underneath, she had written, in large, uneven letters, "Home." Jacob kept his hands busy. He fixed engines, and sometimes he mended things that were not mechanical. An angry neighbor's fence bolt, a church elder's prayer stall. He learned to be generous in ways that matched his means. He became a man known not for a one-time refusal, but for the quiet integrity of daily actions. When people asked him years later what he would do if offered the same bargain again, he would look at them the way a man who had almost lost a lot now looks at cautionary tales, with a steady, soft smile and the tiredness of someone who has kept his hands honest. "There is a price I will not pay," he would say. "Money is easy. A life is not." If this story has moved you, subscribe and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Jacob's place?